meeting with the roundtable that is entitled Neuroscience and Psychology. Throughout the Nobel Award history, many awardees have been Christians, some of them agnostics or atheists. Actually, 78.3% of the Nobel awardees were declared Christians, 65% of physics, 62% of medicine, 54% of economics, and 49.5% of literature were declared themselves Christians. This is just an interesting number, so that maybe you can be surprised at any point in time. We don't want to extract any conclusion from that, because obviously the statistics are just a sample on general status that come from historical events, but it would be wrong to get to conclusions about whether any of the future Nobel awardees are going to be believers or not. Nevertheless, seeing this data, I thought it was significant to listen to another thing, that out of the Nobel awardees of history, 100% of them almost at some point in their lives have felt the desire or the need to express what was their view on the meaning of the world and life. That proves that all human beings, also the most relevant scientists, have to go beyond the data, have the desire to look a bit beyond in order to try to have a cosmoview or a cosmovision that explains to them why it is that we're here and what is our meaning, our end, our goal in this life. As you know, the Francisco de Vitoria University is a university which is inspiring the Christian beliefs, which means that we have some certainties. For sure, we have some certainties, not many, but sure, about God. And obviously, also, we have some certainties about science. The open or expanded reason Congress is not about theology or relationships between science and God, although we are open and willing to talk about that, as we have been discussing yesterday. This Congress, expanded reason, is trying to call our education system to look for always going beyond, always overcoming our prejudices that we all have in our actions. Opening the mind, going beyond, looking for the truth. That, in a few words, is what we mean by expanded reason, because before anything else, we're a university. Well, thank you for coming, and welcome to this adventure. I'm going to tell you how we're going to work today. We're going to start with a roundtable, which is going to deal with a very provocative topic. Many of you who have been here today told me that you were interested in knowing and seeing how we respond to this issue. Are we determined physically and psychologically? Well, in this roundtable, we're going to have a dialogue between neuroscience and psychology, basically. After a pause, we're going to have the communication sessions that is going to be taking place in the same place where we had the communications delivered yesterday. At 4, after lunch, we're going to hold a second round panel, which is going to be entitled Technology and Biotechnology at the Service of Questions About Men or Human Being. And finally, we're going to hold the awardee ceremony of the Expanded Reasons Awards. It's a very nice ceremony, and it's worthwhile. Obviously, we're going to start with the first panel. We're going to have Paul Vitz with us, who presented his book yesterday, a model Christian Catholic Metamodel of person, Therese Lysaught and Clara Molinero also, and the chairman is going to introduce them, the Professor Tasio Perez. I'm going to introduce Tasio, just in case somebody needs him to be introduced. Tasio Perez is a psychologist, an expert in couple and affective sexual education, a master's program in bioethics, and he's specialized in family studies, and he's a professor at our university. Tasio, you have the floor. Thank you.
Pues muchas gracias por haber asistido. Por estar asistiendo.
Thank you very much for attending this roundtable with such an exciting title. Are we determined physically and psychologically? This is a question that philosophy has tried to answer from the 20th century. Neuroscience and psychology has to, and it asks to what extent are we determined by our body and our brain. So the speakers who are sharing the roundtable with me are trying, and they have achieved actually, which is the most important thing, to see the person from an integral perspective, from a bio, psycho-social, spiritual, that it intends to tackle the totality of the person when analyzing the science and other matters. And neuroscience and psychology wonders how to look at the man. What is a view that we have to have with regards to the human being, and how to relate with the human being, and to analyze it not from the vacuum, but integrating all the points of view, and it discovers the human being in its potential.
So we need to understand psychology and neuroscience as something that heals. Psychology and neuroscience should tackle all of the dimensions of the person. What the authors intend is to understand the person from all of their dimensions, and by doing that, allowing them to fully develop and establish the limits between determination and freedom of human being. And for that, today we have with us Paul Vitz, who is a senior scholar, professor of the Institute of Psychological Sciences of Divine Mercy University, and the awardee of the 4th year of Expanded Reason Awards with Catholic Christian Metamodel of Person, Integration of Psychology and Mental Health Practice, the book that was presented yesterday. We have with us also Therese Lysaught. Did I pronounce it correctly, more or less? Yes, more or less? It's not easy, I can tell you. She's a professor of Moral Theology and Healthcare in the Neiswanger Institute of Bioethics and Health Leadership at the School of Medicine, Stritch of the Loyola University in Chicago. And she was awardee of the 5th year of the Expanded Reasons Awards with Biopolitics after Neuroscience, Morality and the Economy of Virtue. And we also have with us Clara Molinero, who is the director of the degree of psychology. Did I pronounce your surname correctly? No, you didn't. It was easy. Clara Molinero. It sounds very Spanish. It's easy for me. She's the director of the degree of psychology at the University Francisco de Vitoria. She's a director of the master's degree in general health psychology. She's a PhD in psychology at the University of Granada. She is a master's degree with methodologies of science of behavior and health at UNED, and she is a becca laureata and a degree at the baccalaureate, in philosophy at the University of Rome. Well, without further ado, we're going to have 20 or 30 minutes for each one of the panelists to talk about their works, and the last half an hour we're going to just dedicate to them. And I'm going to give the floor to Paul Vitz without further ado, so that he talks about his Metamodel. Without further ado, Paul.
Thank you. I'm not going to be talking about my Metamodel. I'm going to be talking about the issue of determinism. Okay? Since that seems to be more relevant to the panel per se. I have basically 3.5 arguments or positions for defending free will in human beings. I will try to summarize them all quickly, but I hope clearly. First, a very important event occurred well over a century ago. Most of you have probably heard of it. It occurred in southern United States when all of a sudden a young girl who had been born not normally, but then at a very early age, became blind and deaf. And her family loved her, but she sort of roamed around, and later she only described herself as like a wild animal. And they called down a young woman from Boston to help teach her. And this woman first took her away from her family to a little cottage in the back of the property and made sure that she was the boss. And then she began teaching Helen, she began teaching her signs. Most of you have heard of this. She would put the young woman, of course, couldn't hear anything, couldn't see anything. And so to try to develop communication with her teacher gave her a sign, a touch, and she gave the touch on the right hand. And that gave a pattern of understanding of supposedly this was the word, just a pattern. And then in her left hand, she would have her hold an object. So she would have an object connected to this pattern on the right hand. Keep in mind the right hand is going to the left hemisphere. The left hand is going to the right hemisphere. One is going to analog codes, the other is going to digital codes. After about 1,000 of these, where she had learned to automatically connect the sign here and the object or thing she was touching here, she had what we would call a lot of paired associate learning. But she was still the same sort of wild animal. Helen Keller was going to become a human being on one particular morning when she was holding her left hand again under water that was coming out from a pump. And suddenly she had the code for water again here. And suddenly she had this enormous insight. She suddenly not just knew that this was associated with that, but she transcended the two and understood that this pattern was the name of that, and that she could name things. And immediately she asked for the name of her teacher and her mother and father and the people in her life and then other things. And she was so excited with this beautiful sudden insight that brought her to an awareness of life as we all know it. She said that day, for the first time in her life, she felt guilt or remorse. For the first time. And how did that happen? Before this event with her hand under the water had occurred earlier in the morning, a doll of hers that she had liked, she had broken into pieces and thrown on the floor. After that event occurred, she walked past and picked up the doll and realized what she had done. And she felt remorse, guilt. It was the first time that she'd ever experienced it. When she went to sleep that night, she knew for the first time there was a tomorrow and there was a yesterday. I believe that what Helen Keller experienced then was the sudden experience of human consciousness, which more and more scientists and others are saying is unique to the human animal. Human consciousness, which is why we're so much more powerful and so much more dominant than any other animal in the world. Even Noam Chomsky thinks this. But anyway, I think it was at that moment that human consciousness came into existence, that free will came into existence. That's when she recognized the responsibility for having done something that she felt that she should not have done. So there's the experience, I believe, of her understanding her responsibility for something is a form of understanding. She had the capacity to have not done it. Second, that's one piece of evidence. That's one. Two, as I mentioned yesterday, psychology has discovered the virtues. And in doing this, they have moved very clearly from what I would call, and they have called, the deterministic model of human beings to a teleological model of human beings, where the person is now capable of choosing a virtue to develop in their life. That is, flourishing is seen as choosing virtues or endpoints in your life. And that the earlier kind of psychology was described as negative psychology, not in a critical sense, just descriptively. It was the psychology of our problems, our pathologies. And though our pathologies are understood as determined, in other words, often they happened, were set up, of course, when we were very young, didn't have much control anyway of our environment, so we had nothing to say about the abandonment of us, let's say when you were 3 years old, or the physical or sexual abuse of you when you were 5 or 7. But these, of course, caused, in a deterministic way, your problems. But they then argued that the only way to go forward was to bring in choice again. And the first choice was the person chose to come to therapy. And that was a free choice, and to try to change. And the second choice is that coming out of therapy, you would choose a virtue. You would have something important in your life, like you'd want to become more altruistic, more courageous, more just, or in some way you would choose a virtue, or several of them, as your goal in life. And this has been done in experimental psychology, so they now study what the virtues in terms of how they develop, what might facilitate learning of them, and so forth. But in any case, they have moved, when they go from understanding our problems as caused by the past to understanding the solution to our problems as caused by our choices, to come into therapy and then to choose virtues as ways of strengthening us and leaving our problems behind. So that is a second way in which determinism is now being criticized in psychology. I guess I would say this is number 2, my second way of thinking about freedom. And when I talk to my students who are going to be therapists, I point out to them that what this means is that as a therapist, you are going to be unlocking the deterministic past of your client in terms of the pathologies that they have, but introducing them into a new realm, a new way of understanding life as about choice and freedom, which is about now understanding your past, which you chose to do, and now moving forward in a positive way with the virtues or some other positive understanding. So that's a movement from determinism to free will, implicit in the goal of psychotherapy itself, and now found in the emphasis in psychology by the people who talk about positive psychology and the virtues. 3, a third way in which I would understand freedom is, and this I can't say very much about, probably you know as much or more, and that is there's something in the spiritual life that implies freedom. I don't know whether it's your experience of prayer or whether it's your experience of, sometimes people talk about the born-again experience, or where their experience is being in communication with Jesus. But I would argue that in the spiritual life, freedom is in essence, free will is part of what's going on. That it's there in some important way. Not only that you have to freely choose God, but that people experience this as an actual choice that they freely make. So that's my third example of evidence for free will and leaving determinism behind. Now I said I had 3.5 interpretations, right? So I have another one, which I just call a half. And that's the behavior of the determinists that I know. Sigmund Freud, in theory, was a determinist. But boy, he expected you to pay your bill. And the professor who argues for no free will, everything's determined, he gets in his car and he's driving home and somebody cuts him off and he shakes his fist at him. In other words, the people who argue for determinism don't play the game through. That is, they behave like you're responsible when you insult them, or that you're, as their dean or something, supposed to give them a raise because they had a new book published, or something of that kind. And if you answered, well, that was just determined. You don't deserve anything for that, do you? And I'm determined not to give you a raise. So there. Well, they'd probably go try to find a lawyer, right? But in any case, my 1/2 reason is that the determinists themselves don't behave in agreement with their own argument. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Teresa, your turn.
Well, I don't have 3.5 arguments. My project, can I say a little bit about the book?
Of course.
So it is an extraordinary honor to be here, and particularly to have received the award. And I bring apologies on behalf of my 2 co-authors who couldn't be here because of family reasons, daughters graduating from high school and whatnot. So on behalf of Jeff Bishop and Andrew Michaels, I also bring sincere thanks. So we take up this question of freedom and determinism in our project, but we were a little more interested in why are people asking this question, and why are they asking it now, right? Where is this? It's a relatively new claim, right? That neuroscience has determined that we have no free will. So we wanted to try to get behind where's that question coming from, and why are people asking it? So around 2009, 2010, there were a few things going on in at least American culture that we thought were peculiar. First, there was this growing conversation in the public square that had a long history, but it was becoming louder and louder, that was making claims about poor people, that poor people weren't poor because they didn't have money. They were poor because they were people of vice. So because they did not have virtue, the outcome was poverty. There was also a long-standing counter-argument that it wasn't vice that caused poverty, rather it was social structures of poverty that caused vice. So people who were living under extreme conditions would, of course, behave in problematic ways. But there was this assumption that there was a relationship between economics and, if not virtue, at least vice. And then there was this sort of implicit claim that if you were a person of wealth, if you had economically prospered, that was a result of your virtue, right? You worked hard, you lived clean, and the outcome was a monetary reward. So we were really interested in this relationship between economics and virtue theory. A second piece of the conversation that emerged around then had to do with the relationship between poverty and biology. So there were new studies coming out that people who lived in areas of significant poverty had higher cortisol levels. They may exhibit what was coming to be understood as embodied trauma responses, right? So they had seen gun violence, or they had been beaten as a child, and so they were capacitated to respond in the sort of classic fight, flight, freeze responses pre-consciously. And so we were intrigued by this And we wanted to explore the question of, well, if poverty has embodied effects, what would that entail for our understanding of courage, right? If your cortisol levels are higher because of where you live, do you have the same ability to be courageous in a particular situation? What does it mean for things like temperance? So we were intrigued with these questions, and in 2010, the University of Chicago offered a Templeton grant program on the science of virtues. So we thought, partly because all three of us had backgrounds in both science and philosophy and virtue theory, and because we thought neuroscience might give us an insight into these two questions, we applied for a grant, we got a grant. And so we embarked onto a study of this emerging field of the neuroscience of morality. And we thought it would give us an answer to these questions, but instead, of course, it gave us more questions. And we were surprised by what we found. First, we found a very significant biological reductionism, right? As in many scientific fields, there is the sort of academic science, the bench science that gets done, and very quickly that gets translated into popular newspapers and magazines and TV shows. And especially on the public side, there were very strong claims of reductionism. So, you could find a raft of books entitled things like The Moral Brain, The Ethical Brain, The Hardwired Brain, right? And I could list 10, 12, 20 titles. But this assumption that we don't really have free will, it's determined, and neuroscience is going to give us the answer to this question. And so we were like, We were also intrigued because if neuroscience is going to study anything, but particularly if it's going to study something like morality, all you scientists know, you need to have a very clearly defined object, right? So we were interested in what account of morality are they studying, right? How are they conceptualizing morality so that it can be operationalized, so that it can be studied? And what we found was that it was not very clearly defined. But one of the most interesting things we discovered was, as we began to study this literature, one particular pattern emerged. In this neuroscience of morality, there's sort of two sides of it, which Paul has referred to as negative psychology and positive psychology. But we discovered that, or as you may know, scientists prefer to be objective, especially bench scientists prefer to use objective language. So, especially on the negative psychology side, they didn't really want to use terms like vice, or lying, or theft, right? Because these terms have a lot of cultural baggage and they have a lot of religious baggage. We found positive psychology, as you noted, to be much more open to using traditional virtue language. So Seligman, has his account of character and virtue. There's a large area on the neuroscience of wisdom. So you see more traditional virtue language on that side. But what we discovered is that on both sides, the move has been to move away from traditional virtue language and to develop what we call proxies clinical proxies for virtue and vice language. Terms like empathy or sociopathy or pro-social behaviors and attitudes and antisocial behavior and attitudes. So when the neuroscientists of morality construct their studies, these are the terms that they use, right? So they look at variables to correlate with pro-social attitudes and behaviors or antisocial attitudes and behaviors. Traditional virtue concepts are in the background. They're in the mix. They emerge every so often and then go back into the background. So they're doing a lot of work, but they're sort of hidden. We thought that was interesting. Finally, there's a couple more points, but I'll just make one more. One of the striking things we found as we dove into these studies was that especially on the antisocial attitudes and behaviors side, a bulk of the studies in looking to find variables that correlated with negative traits, by and large, they focused on one primary variable, which was socioeconomic status. So here in the bench top scientific journal literature, we discovered this same dynamic that we had seen in the public rhetoric before we even started, namely that there was an assumption that there was a correlation between now this proxy for vice and economics. On the other side, socioeconomic variables were not as much examined in the scientific studies, but they were certainly built into the study populations for example, studies on the neuroscience of wisdom. If you look through the journal literature, here again, major study populations for this literature often were cognitive scientists themselves, various sorts of professionals, surprisingly to me, very often college students who, having a couple college students myself, I don't normally think of as primary candidates for wisdom, but there was certainly, this study population was drawn from a higher socioeconomic class, and as you kind of analyze the criteria for wisdom, they begin to look like the criteria for economic success. So what we found, and this, I can say more about this later, but what we found was that as the neuroscience of morality was looking into the brain to find who the human person is, what they found was our cultural anthropology rooted in our economics. So as we argue, the person that they find there is the most recent mutation of Homo economicus, who is, as we call them, Homo capitalis. And this, we think, is why this question of free will and determinism has become of interest. I'll leave it right there for right now.
Thank you very much. Adelante. Todo tuyo, Clara.
Bueno, yo quería presentar como
Well, I would
respuesta,
like to
si acaso, como propuesta a esta
present
pregunta sobre el
as
determinismo
response to
físico y
this
psicológico, el
question
trabajo
of
que hacemos en el
physical
grado
and
de
psychological
psicología y en el
determinism,
máster de
what we
psicología.
work in
Represento a
the
todo un
degree of
equipo aquí de
psychology and the
profesores
masters of psychology. I represent a
que
group of teachers here
ante
that
la propuesta epistemológica que tenemos generalmente,
conscience
¿no?, detrás de la psicología,
vis-a-vis the
trabajamos
epidemiological
por
question that we have
precisamente
behind
demostrar o probar o
psychology. We
conocer
work
las
towards
limitaciones
proving or acknowledging
detrás de una
the
propuesta
limitations
determinista
behind that
que finalmente es
deterministic
filosófica,
proposal
¿no?,
that
epistemológica,
is
una
basically
visión
philosophical,
antropológica estrecha, hijos de nuestro
narrow
tiempo.
vision, children of our time, and actually fruit of my own concern, because I, from the beginning of my professional development, even if trying to help people through psychology, willing to help them improve and reach an integral life, I realized that the answers from psychology were determined by the epistemological assumptions of the time. So we thought that we have to work from an open position. We have neurologists, and we have people who don't find a conflict between doing neuroscience and trying to limit the perspective of a deterministic position. Within the degree and in the meetings, the staff meetings that we have, we stumbled against certain determinisms, and we studied them because they were limiting our work, and because empirically they didn't have a reason for being in the people we were working with. A deterministic vision made it impossible for us to work, and the people we were working with overcame these anthropological and epistemological responses. So in this sense, we try to investigate the limits of the proposals of each and every psychology school, with the intention to discover the epistemological and anthropological foundations that lie behind these small discoveries, and small steps that we have been taking are afterwards transferred to education, and this means that our students are growing with open mentality that try to overcome the limitations of philosophy of the time and psychology of the time. As the previous speakers just said, we are surrounded by these biological, neurological determinism that make us believe that people have a linear action, so to speak, and leave aside so many other variables that make us rich as human beings. To speak about spirituality in this psychological environment, it's even like a hard work. So this open reason or expanded reason approach have allowed us to find a line to open the dialogue with the different sciences and also with psychology. I wanted to talk about some initiatives that we have done. Below, on the top floor, we also have a poster and the initiatives that have taken place. The degrees do an end-of-degree thesis that can be a type of intervention, but we also have a fourth type, which is an anthropological TFG. This is a end-of-degree thesis. So they review what is the anthropological background behind some psychotherapy proposals or some psychology concepts, and we find very creative initiatives, some rather daring, but if they have a good tutor, they can have a good outcome. And having the double degree of criminology and psychology, all the explanation of the criminal act, why people can have antisocial behaviors or criminal behaviors, has been greatly enriched with an explanation that is to be open to the anthropological knowledge and to an ethical training. And in these regards, our students discuss about what is truth within this degree of criminology and psychology, of what is good, of where we leave the concept of health, because sometimes we correlate health with psychological well-being. So all this has opened new terrain, new domains for research, very rich ones. Even our statistical subject is full of this concern about expanded reasons. So we discuss about about what is the data, what do we do when we make a variable operational. So it opens the mind of the students so as to have an interpretation of the outcome in the research, which is much more responsible. As a last experiment, our students even tried to create a test through the psychometry subject and in relation with other subjects to try to measure what expanded reason truly is. It has been a funny experiment that we hope we will be able to keep developing. So this, with the work with our students, that opens a whole group of expanded reason mentalities and working in the area more specifically of social psychology with this approach of expanded reason and provoking questions in the field of ethics and senses. Our students are in touch with NGOs that attend groups of people that have social problems or social exclusion, and also at work. In the work environment, our students, hand in hand with other students from other degrees in the university, they left with a concern of aligning the sense of life with a very romantic feeling that when they landed in a job, it was hard to put to practice. So looking to the labor perspective, it has helped them to link their emotional expectations with real life. So this approach of expanded reason has opened many doors for us in our staff groups. We have been working much on this, shedding a lot of light on all the many faculties that the person can find in his or her everyday life. So the dialogue between epistemology and psychology with the empirical data enriches all the data themselves. And in the psychology applied realm, we have found areas where to work in the educational field, in the working field, where to be able to think about the sense of psychology, epistemology, has allowed us to understand all the violent phenomena that grow in the classroom, all the learning experiences that students face in their experience as students, and to try to enrich their experiences so that they not only learn, but they also have a much richer experience finally. And you will probably have been able to deduct from the previous speakers, realm of virtues is a realm, a domain that keeps growing, and it is relatively new for contemporary psychology. It had a lot of prejudices because of the religious touch it may have. So we are trying to work in developing, for instance, affection and other virtues, and to share with what I do, to share with you what I do with my research group. We have worked on magnanimity translated to forgiveness. The empirical environment applied is not so far from philosophy, and they're both enriching. So this is what we do so far. Thank you. Thank you to the three. I can think of many questions, probably all of you can, but listening to you three, I thought of a question in line with what you just said. My question is, to what extent can we think that psychology or psychotherapy, this process of trying to help the patient is a process which at the end of the day is basically educating him to recover his freedom in virtues. To what extent this is true? A patient that is determined by his background, his injuries, his luckiness, he gets to the psychologist, and the psychologist has to educate him in virtues and to help him recover his virtues and freedom or free will. Any of you can answer.
I defer to the psychologist.
Okay. Well, first of all, the person who comes into therapy has already made a choice to try to change their life. And that's very important. Second, you don't try to choose exactly what, they should learn as a virtue. Usually one of the things you do, and this is part of our own new model, is we have to look at the patient, we have to look at our clients as having strengths to start with. That is, they already have some virtue, some character strengths. And most psychotherapy evaluation doesn't look at that. And our model argues that this is very important because what you want to do is to strengthen their already present virtues and to look at the weaknesses that need to be addressed. And all of this is done in a free will discussion with the client, so it's not as though you're sort of imposing anything deterministically on them. And I think this is very, very important. I'll make one other comment that's relevant here. I did a study of school shooters in America, mass school shooters, that is, school shooters who killed more than one person or shot at more than one person, and it wasn't somebody they knew. There was random shooting. And these are called technically mass school shooters. And I ended up with about 21 of them. And these were all school shooters in the United States. First of all, I hadn't thought about this. They were all in public schools. There were none in private or religious schools. But they were all in public schools of a kind that would imply they were middle class. None of these school shooters was black. They were almost all normal, middle-class, white males. Of the 20 or 21, only one was a female. And what most people had been doing is studying what were their bad problems, Were they high in anxiety? Were they high in, or did they have lots of antisocial behavioral indices? I didn't look at that. I tried to find out what did they have. I discovered what was missing. The dog that didn't bark. None of them had any goal in life of a higher nature. They weren't interested in becoming musicians. They weren't interested in becoming athletes. They weren't interested in becoming even admitted to college. They had no higher goals. And so this implies that the absence of the higher meaning in life, which was present in their lives, and not as a socioeconomic condition, is a serious liability. Enough.
Madre mía. Aquí en España no tenemos de estos.
Todavía.
No, todavía, ¿no? Por ahora no. Pero qué interesante. Clara, ¿tú qué piensas de esta cuestión que he lanzado yo?
Sí, yo a lo mejor voy a ser un poco incorrecta, pero querría traer también el peligro de volvernos deterministas en este otro sentido. Y ahora resulta que la virtud o que el trabajo en virtud fuera otro determinismo. No me gustaría. Prefiero hablar como, que es algo de lo que también aprovecho del Metamodel cuando lo hemos utilizado, es hablar de plenitud, de florecer a las personas, intentar integrar todos los ámbitos de información laminado, ¿no?, decir en el Metamodel, que podamos aprovechar todos. Y nosotros, hablo también por mi claustro, intentamos trabajar desde un enfoque fenomenológico en el sentido de que dejemos que la realidad se manifieste, nos hable, recojamos toda la información que nos pueda dar en cualquiera de sus registros y ayudemos a crecer a las personas en toda su plenitud posible. Es verdad que a veces esta información nos puede venir de las virtudes que vemos que tienen o de las que vemos que no tienen tan desarrolladas, también de su información biológica, también de la historia, también. Creo que cuando hemos hecho en cualquier escuela de psicología un gran hallazgo, nos ha parecido que era lo más, ¿no?, ese hallazgo. Y creo que es mantener una visión integral y un modelo de mirada hacia la persona que sea libre para recoger todos los nuevos descubrimientos que podamos encontrar, es lo que le va a dar validez a nuestra intervención. Así que eso diría yo.
Teresa.
I have to wait for the translator to stop. I think this is a really important question, and I'm really glad to hear about Clara's work looking at the epistemology and anthropology behind the models, because, again, I think the broader context of your question is, in what environment is our practice of psychology working? What are the assumptions of the field? What are the images that the field uses? I appreciate that we're having this conversation here at the Expanded Reason Institute, because I think in a different context, this conversation wouldn't make any sense, right? So I think for the practice of the field most broadly, when a client comes in, what's the goal? The goal is to get them to, not necessarily to flourish, right? To fit into society better, to function better within our society. But if the society malforms us, what are we healing them for, right? One of the things that we outline in our book, we were very informed by a psychologist, a pastoral psychologist in the United States named Bruce Rogers Vaughan, who wrote a book entitled Caring for Souls in a Neoliberal Age. And in this book, he charts how, in the United States at least, and probably globally, since 1980, there are a couple things happened in the 1980s. First, this new economic model of neoliberalism began to ascend, first in the United States and Britain, then across Europe, and then eventually across the globe. And there has been this correlation of increase in mental health problems and the increase in this economic context that we're in. And he attributes it to a couple of factors, but primarily the dismantling of local communities on very individualistic economic models, the elimination of spirituality and goals and churches and these kinds of organizations, but also a shift to a different model of psychology, which is a highly biological model. So instead of the client coming in and receiving counseling, they come in and receive medication, right? So starting around 1980 with the DSM 345, I forget which one it was then, but there was a shift in the practice of psychiatry and psychology away from a very person-centered model of practice to this sort of biologically reductionistic model of practice. Also correlated with the fact that now there are pharmaceutical companies who create products that need a market so that they can make money, right? And so this is the context in which much psychology is practiced. And many psychologists, are formed by these assumptions and go do what they think is a good job, but what they're doing is they're just capacitating broken people to work better in a broken system, right? Which is not really healing. So I think teaching psychologists to ask these kinds of questions, right? What is the anthropology? What are that's animating your practice? What are the goals of treatment? What would flourishing really look like? Because if we are to counsel people to flourish in a way we think they need to flourish, they may not fit into society very well, right? So then we have to, what's the context for doing that? Do we have communities that they can then work in? That seems to me to be a challenge for the field of psychology.
One post note here, our Metamodel, which I didn't talk about, does explicitly provide a framework for understanding the person, and we're very clear about this. We put free will in the Metamodel. Not only do we bring free will in there and the search for virtues and for vocation, but we also have put in the soul. And the soul has been completely omitted from almost all contemporary psychology. But the presence of the soul is also a way of making sort of always available the idea that human consciousness is qualitatively different from anything else in the animal world, and that it involves free will. But at any rate, we put it explicitly in our model, and therefore we hope it will be there for always in the mind of the therapists who use it. And we are also therefore requiring those who don't have our assumptions to make it clear that they don't and to defend them.
Pues a raíz de esto, ¿cómo se ha implementado el metamodelo en la Divine Mercy University?
Okay, we can implement it there because the students are told that this will be the model. By the way, we have, for the model, the most important programs are our doctoral program in clinical psychology, and we have a master's program in counseling. And the master's program in counseling goes for only about 2.25 years, and it's not all online. It's 90% online, then 10% takes place there. The interesting thing is the two people who are in charge of the counseling program are both serious Protestants. They're sort of evangelical Protestants. We couldn't find any serious counselors who were Catholic, who were at least able to come to Virginia and take over for us. So they find that they call it the Catholic model, but they say it's a Catholic Christian model. The Christian component is very basic and not especially theologically divisive. But we implement it there, and that means it's brought into all the classes. It means that when they do a dissertation, they have to relate the topic of their dissertation to the model. It means we have special videos where aspects of the model are discussed, which the students have to take and observe. And so but we've discovered that we can't just do it with the students. We have to do it with the faculty first. They need to, we hire people, every so often during a year. You'll have maybe one, in a faculty, you'll have turnover of one every year or two. And so after a while, you have new people coming in. So they have to be educated in the meta model. And so we have programs for doing that, for integrating it with our existing faculty, and then for integrating it with the new faculty, and then for making sure it gets mentioned in the counseling sessions that are part of the counseling program, and that it's mentioned in our PsyD, that is the doctoral psychology program. But you have to seriously monitor its introduction as a framework. It's not it's not rocket science to understand what we're emphasizing, but you have to make people sort of begin to think about it and begin to have it as a framework for approaching any other psychotherapy model that they might be using. It doesn't in any way reject any model of psychotherapy that has good evidence for its effectiveness, it may reject some of their assumptions, but those are, not relevant to its application. But we do have to constantly work at bringing it in an integrative way into their own education. You can't just publish it, tell them to read it, and forget about it. You got to get hands-on with integrating it into their actual educational experience and into their case histories.
Clara, nosotros cuando estudiamos psicología...
Clara, when we study psychology, we don't study any of this, right? And we have had to build all of this vision after the experience. But it is true that in our universities, when we studied psychology in Spain, we didn't have any of this. What is going to be the difference between our students and your students, or their students? How different are they going to be from us when we studied our university degree? What does this contribute to them? What's the difference between what we saw and what we have had to build? I hope that they get many questions, that they become restless, that they face many question marks and they are forced to work. That's what they need to do. Not only the metamodel, but also the questions about anthropology, epistemology, ethics that we have behind this meaning, the sense. I hope that it gives them clues about targets or white spaces rather that they didn't solve totally, and that may help them start the rest of their careers and their professional development. In my case, I studied my degree in Peru, by the way. My school was psychoanalytic, basically, and psychoanalysis was a religion almost in my university. And I became restless, and I started to ask about other ways in order to start studying about other psychotherapy schools and study outside psychology also. So I hope that we leave them many question marks, many problems that they have to solve. Good. Therese, apart from neuroscience, which other implications does your work have in other different fields?
As one book review said, every field. So I liked that. So, as I said, we set out with one particular question, and we got an answer that was very different than the answer we thought we would find. But we tried to stay very focused on the neuroscience of morality to, make our conclusions very tight. But we do think that the findings in our book are relevant to just about any contemporary science. Because one of the things we do, so we get to the end of the first part of the book and we say, wow, this field of the neuroscience of morality is deeply shaped by the anthropology of neoliberalism. The economics that Pope Francis calls the economy that kills, right? I mean, he's been very clear about the implications of this anthropology. And then we say, well, where did it come from, right? How did we get here? So in the second half of the book, we work backwards historically to try to trace how did this anthropology develop, and we do so by unpacking the deeply intertwined fields of economics, social science, and physical science, natural science, all the way back through the 20th century and the 19th century and into the 18th century, back to, through John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and Thomas Malthus and David Hume, which figures huge in this literature, and back to Francis Bacon. And we believe that this same trajectory, now if you move forward, has shaped a number of other scientific fields, right? So any field that bears on the human is going to have an implicit anthropology. And most scientists aren't trained, like yours, to say, well, what is the anthropology here? They just they're trained in the model, they go do it. They bring into the situation their own implicit anthropologies from living in our culture. And it's not their fault. We all do that. We can't walk into any situation or question without all of our cultural formation that we bring in. But we believe that any science, other fields of biology, social sciences, they all are deeply shaped by assumptions about who the human person is and how the human person functions in our culture, in social groups. And so we hope that we offer a challenge to each of these professions to stop and say, what is your anthropology? Where does it come from? Is there an alternative? How did you get here? Do you actually believe that? Is that good? Ask these kinds of questions. What I think we don't have, or maybe it's an invitation, is to try to create the spaces where those conversations can happen. Right? So you were in Peru studying psychology, where it was irreligion, and you probably weren't having conversations with people outside that field. And in a lot of our universities, we get very siloed, right? We just talk to people in our department, and there aren't really, sometimes we don't even talk to the people in our departments unless we go to a conference. Oh, hi, how are you doing? How do we create spaces, especially for scientists, to begin to engage questions that they're not trained in, right? I mean, these are not easy questions to answer, but I think that's something that we can bring in the spirit of dialogue, very much like John Slattery was talking about yesterday with this dialogue between religion and science, creating openness, creating spaces. These are not short-term conversations, but creating a place that's safe for, scientists don't ever want to look stupid either, right? So a place where they can ask
people do.
real questions and not feel like, they are out of their water, but, so.
Thank you very much. Bueno, yo creo que es el momento también para escuchar vuestras preguntas.
Thank you so much. It's now a good time to listen to questions and continue with the Q&A. So you have the floor.
Thank you all very much for your presentations and also for the work you've been doing, both academically and with these wonderful books that have won the award. So we kind of been focusing in this discussion, you've been focusing on therapeutic interventions and sort of the reductionist view of the human person and so on that goes into that. That same sort of reductive view of both the human person and of morality is also informing debates about so-called moral enhancement of human beings, right? Using biotechnology to morally enhance. And again, as I said, many of these proposals are very reductionistic and so fall under a lot of the same critiques that you've already been voicing about certain forms of therapeutic interventions. But at least some proposals are out there purporting to be in line with classical virtue theory, basically using biotechnology to help human beings to become more virtuous. And so, again, I don't know how familiar each of you is with this literature, but I just would be interested in hearing your thoughts in general about whether there could be a use of biotechnology, again, not in a reductivist sense, but in a sense to help enhance humans' capacity to be virtuous. Thank you.
It's for you.
Well, okay, a few points. On the one hand, as probably most of you know, most of the literature doesn't focus on enhancement, it focuses on how do we get rid of bad traits, right? So either through various sorts of eugenic methods, or by medicating people, or by imprisoning people, right? So how do we eliminate bad traits, mostly from society? Not so much from people, but from society. That's 95% of the field. And then you have 5% on enhancement. Most of that is, in my reading, is not terribly interested in morality, right? It's like intelligence or economic capacity, and then there's a little bit about morality. But a first question would be, you know, if virtue is enhanced, is it still moral? Right? If it's determined, is it still free? Right, that would be. But one of the things that we came to begin to see in our research that bears on this question is, well, okay, so if we're enhancing this person, toward what? Right, again, what's the goal? And if we're doing these interventions, it doesn't look like the person is so free anymore. And what we see is in economics, in economic theory that precedes this sort of neuroscientific theory of morality, there is a very significant but subtle shift that happens. Many people are probably familiar with Milton Friedman and the champions of liberal economics through the 20th century, where the person, the anthropology, was rational and free, right? These were the two key characteristics of the human person. And the human person had to be free in order to make rational decisions about their economics, right? So laissez-faire government and this vision of the human person. In economic theory, however, as we move into the late 1990s, early 2000s, there's this shift where economics, capitalism, the invisible hand, all of a sudden becomes embedded in nature. So that, lo and behold, who would have thought capitalism is natural? It is in our biology. So there's this shift so that this sort of economic vision of the human person no longer is really free. We can make some voluntary choices, but overall we're not free. And I would say that most proposals for enhancement fall right in line with that, right? Because who am I going to make you become? I'm going to make you become more aligned with this subtle vision of the human person who fits really, really well into this neo-capitalist new structure where, yeah, you're enhanced and so you're not exactly free, but that's okay. You can make a choice or two within this, but your biology will take you and our community where we need to go. So that's what I would say to those people. And just to add a little caveat on the back of that, the other thing that we discovered as we went back through history to 1710 was that in the history of the West, in our social science and in our economics, we discovered what we call in the book a bifurcated anthropology. So from very early on in the 18th century, there is strong claims, right, that the poor are not free, right? The poor, back to this poverty and vice sort of thing, right? The poor are controlled by their sexual lust. They're over-reproducing, and they're not working because they're lazy, and therefore, they should not be free, right? They're a burden on society, and so we should definitely not pay the money, right? Charity goes away in this period. The Catholic Church had long cared for the poor via charity. There's huge, centuries-long arguments about whether we should actually give charitable care to the poor. Charity becomes a vice in this period. They're not free. So they are put in jail, they are put in workhouses, they are because they don't have capital, they are not free. Those who have capital, those who have wealth, have to have the freedom to determine how to use that wealth. So there develops this split in the human person where those who have money are free and those who don't have money are not free. But then, toward the end of the 20th century, that even shifts so that nobody's free anymore. Or at least that's how we read it, but...
Muchas gracias por las intervenciones. Una pregunta.
Thank you very much for your presentations. I have a question, especially based on your experience as therapist. I understood very clearly from your presentations that we are not determined physically nor psychologically, at least not totally. So the question is this genetic and quantitative, and therefore it's almost impossible to respond? To what extent are we determined physically or psychologically, especially thinking from the perspective of negative psychology, pathologies, that is to say, to what an extent a psychologist finds some situations that are not possible to overcome even with a medical intervention. Clara Molinero used the term relationism. So she's appealing to an intervention where one does not believe that grace has to intervene in order to reach supernatural objectivism. But maybe there's some times of elections where the psychology believes that with effort and with therapy everything can be achieved. To what extent do we need to acknowledge situations that cannot be overcome for freedom where you work even with the exercise of virtues? I will try to start so that the other two speakers rescue me afterwards. Yes, effectively, I've been working as a psychotherapist from 2006, and I believe that, yes, psychotherapy first is a discipline that is very young within the disciplines of health. I believe, actually, it is one of the youngest ones. We need to develop it more. It is true that in order to work in psychotherapy, we try, at least in my work in general, maybe when you generalize, just oversimplify, but anyway, we try to discover, we try to have the person discover and know what they have inside, what they have lived. That will give them part of the freedom, because the first step in order to be free is knowing, and people sometimes come ignoring what they have inside, what they have lived, and how that may being an obstacle to grow and so on. So the phase of knowing frees people a lot. There's another phase, finding meaning, purpose, motivation, and so on. That also encourages a lot, and it's a driving force that triggers a lot of developments that help people. I humbly would say that in therapy very often I start with these two levers and people as human beings that tend to be in health and be better. The first people to be interested in living better, they tend to take off and flourish quite a lot, and from there onwards they start working. Sometimes I have seen myself appealing the providence and telling them, Lord, if you love them more than I do, give them the resources. I don't say that in therapy, but it happens. Very specific examples of things that have happened to me. Maybe somebody who was suffering and was very isolated, because, by the way, isolation, being alone, is one of the big illnesses of our times also. And they have suddenly found in the hands of therapy with opportunities in order to stop being alone and lonely, in order to meet with others, and those are phenomena, forces, strengths and resources that I didn't contribute to the therapy, but they appear. And also with therapy, you realign morally, or they are realigned morally also, and so there's confluence of phenomena and forces that go beyond the use of will in order to train ourselves and be more skillful, and they are joining together. So I'm just a spectator sometimes. I live with gratitude the fact that people are helped by tools that are outside of the therapeutic environment, that are not under my control. And Pelagianism, in any case, to me is one of the threats of the psychologist who intends to predict the behavior somehow. We need to give up that. In therapy, we need to try to provide people with all the resources and facilities so that they're better, as ambiguous and indefinite as it may sound. We cannot predict when there's going to be success, or when the therapy is going to fail, or when the person finds the way of going ahead and when they don't. There's something that escapes our control, and I believe that we need to leave it in the hands of God to offset that, to compensate that.
Voy a aportar un poquito desde...
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Amen. And I think I would add to that. I think we also need to listen to some of our terms, right? So, what does it mean to be determined, right? I mean, a lot of times when people use that term, it sounds like your whole entire life is determined. It's like Calvinism. God decided everything ahead of time, and you're just going to go do it. Or are we saying that everything is multifactorial, right? There's multifactorial. There's inputs, and we can think about it differently. So one thing we need to think about is, what work does this word determined do? Are there situations that can't be overcome? I mean, that's such a great question. I think one of the things I heard you saying is that we need to think about, well, what are the root causes of those situations? Our conversation wants to find those in genes or in neurons, because then we can find some sort of technological fix, right, that usually can be marketed. But my experience, I think what you just said, the source of these problems, the source of this brokenness is largely social, right? And there was a book that I used to teach. I taught it for like 15 years, written by a physician who moved to Washington, D.C. and spent 10 years living in community with homeless men. They built a building, because in the United States, with our terrible healthcare system, the physician would take care of a patient, a homeless patient, and then send them back out onto the street, where the therapy you just did would be completely ineffective. So they built a place where homeless men could stay and get better, and he and his family lived in this community with them. And over the course of his 10 years, he discovered that there were people who were broken. Their brokenness could not be overcome. But it wasn't genetic, and it wasn't their neurons, right? Our society had battered them from such an early age, and they just could not recover. And his conclusion, and the conclusion of Bruce Rogers Vaughan, who I mentioned earlier, was essentially what they need is the church, right? So Vaughan, who is a pastoral psychologist and who is a Baptist, I think, but again, you can tell he feels a little odd talking about religion, so it comes in a postscript. But he says, I think what we need are communities of the broken, communities of the expelled, places where they can find community. And he thinks that maybe that's the church. The church is not a place for the perfect, it's a place for the broken. He draws on some theologians. Sounds a little bit like the church as a field hospital, but this was before Pope Francis. But it seems to me that the experience of people who have for most of the people who have met these situations that can't be overcome, what the therapy they see is Christian community, which I find compelling.
Effectively, there's something in common in your answers to the question. The example that Paul gave us at the beginning about the person that didn't see, didn't hear. The key is the relationship that one establishes, the power of that relationship. In any case, vis-a-vis those injuries, those supposed determinations that we have in our history, the relationship we establish with the therapist, with the community, with the church, it is the one that has the power to generate a change that it has to do with accepting what you are, what you have, which is a huge change, and then obviously it may add resources to do other changes. But the key in that sense is the relationship. If there had not been anyone who had taught the objects and touching what each object was, there would not have been any change. And the therapeutic relationship makes reference to two people. It makes reference to a relationship, and that is the power of relationship that may cause that change. Any more questions?
One thing I can bring in.
Of course.
Okay. The topic has been the problem of unanswerable problems. And in a certain foundational sense, that's what the Christian message is an answer to. The foundational problem that we find we have no solution to is, of course, death. And second, the notion that you can have an incurable problem before you die is the whole problem of it seems reasonable to think. We know in medicine where we have pretty good health, we have pretty good remedies for most of our illnesses. We still know people get illnesses which are not curable. And it's quite possible that we have psychological problems that are not curable and that won't ever be curable. And of course, there's a spiritual answer to this, which is the carrying of the cross. And that is the foundational message to potentially this community of brokenness and why it should be in the church. But we have to recognize that psychology has limits as to what it can cope with. And just because you have a psychological problem doesn't mean there's a psychological answer. Just because you have a medical problem may not mean there's really a medical answer that we have for it, but there could be a spiritual answer. But that, of course, means our psychology has to become a little more humble.
Thank you very much.
Gracias. ¿Ahora? Sí. Bueno, sobre todo gracias a todos.
Well, thank you to all the speakers for their exposés, and I actually leave with this message you have just given. It is very important to be able to differentiate between the problems in the soul and pathologies, and psychology has a limit, and one of the main important things is to know what the limit is. Injuries that, as you very well said, can only be cured by God. But what I am concerned, and my question is, considering psychology, education, as two of the most important sciences and fundamental sciences that exist, and knowing the great amount of knowledge that both psychologists and teachers must have. You said anthropology, virtues, issues. How can we make that teachers and psychologists that have such an enormous responsibility vis-a-vis our young people, but not only our young people, can work on themselves and have the tools that will allow them to be constantly changing and transforming themselves. Because how can we tell someone to grow in virtues? Well, how can we guarantee that teachers and psychologists that are going to play such an important role in the search of people's plenitude be constantly working themselves on that responsibility that they have? I would dare to say that the educational system and professional development doesn't favor this, but if we seed this concerned and this humbleness, that no matter how much I train myself, I'm going to be at a minimum level to be able to give a response. And also, so this humbleness and this hope that the knowledge and practice of psychology can keep growing, this can motivate and this can encourage us. I'm going to refer again to our faculty and to our students to be able to dialogue and present our doubts without any complex, to share one another and help ourselves in the research without having anything to defend, without me having to defend my psychotherapeutical school or my field in psychology where I am expert. This hope and this humbleness, this hope that we can keep growing because our vocation so demands. This frees us from the burden that actually the pride of the scientist may have and allows us to keep going. When I started, I thought I won't be able to make it, but together with people who have kept stimulating me, you keep growing. Patients motivate you, they teach you, and with the humbleness of knowing that you still have not reached any goal, but with the responsibility that we have to keep discovering. This is a path that you start, but you can keep advancing in it. So lately, I'm not so fearful with my conscious that we are little, but with a desire of doing it better and better. So I'm just going to leave it as ambiguously as I have had.
I think that's a very good answer.
But I think I would add, because I think we talked a little bit about this yesterday also, that in teaching virtues to our students, the most important thing is to model them, right? That the teachers have to be practitioners and you show what virtue looks like rather than just didactically teaching what it is or having them read about it. But in truth, the context also needs to support the teachers and psychologists in living the virtues as well. Like the virtues are not individual. Sometimes we talk about virtue as if they're individual traits. I can just work on my virtue and get more virtuous. But virtue, at least for Aristotle and Aquinas, are communal practices. And some of us were talking later yesterday, if you try to be at the university and practice humility, well, you're not going to get very far. Because our academic structures, it's all about sell yourself. Or in medicine, right? If your vision of medicine is spending time listening to your patient because you are person-centered, well, the economic structures of medicine don't let you do that anymore, right? So there's this tension for practitioners who want to model the virtues to their patients and their students, but our structures don't let them. So, how can we continue to move upstream to create contexts that, that allow not just our students to flourish or our patients to flourish, but our practitioners to flourish and therefore our community to flourish. I mean, that's an uphill battle.
I just want to add there, one of the reasons the psychiatrists in the whole field of psychiatry, let's say beginning primarily in the 80s, moved to medication as the answer, was the psychiatrists discovered they were the lowest paid specialists in medicine. And the reason for that was that if you if you charged per hour and you had a 50-minute hour and you were doing that in an interpersonal sense with your patient, you could only charge maybe $400 or at max per hour, and then you didn't have all your hours covered. So the result was that you had a low income. And so with medication, however, you can have a 10-minute period with your client and find out how the medication is going and then give a prescription. And you see 5 people in that hour, and the result was that your income went way up. Right. And in addition, you got support and sort of informal bribery from the from the drug companies. They took you out to dinner and gave you free samples that you could sell and other things. So it was a very major economic effect on psychiatry, that it was not making enough money, that it led to its movement toward giving medication and dropping the interpersonal.
Terrible.
How terrible.
Bueno, en primer lugar, agradeceros muchísimo esta mesa redonda.
Well, first and foremost, I would like to thank all the people at the round table, because it is extremely interesting. And I would like to change a little bit the topic, because you have spoken of determinism caused by the background, trauma, economic situation, or lack of expectations. But I would like to talk about other determinism, that which says that decisions, behaviors of the human being are determined because of cerebral or brain processes. I would like to ask you if those processes are the causes of our desires, decisions, will, or if there are any experiments or research in that regards.
Teresa.
I'm a theologian, not a neuroscientist.
Todos te miran, todos te
miran. I
miran.
know, everybody's looking at me. I think, that's a great question. But, one of the things that has happened in the history of science in the last 50 or 60 years is that we will often get a little bit of data and then make these grand conclusions from this little bit of data. And then 10 years later, we discover that maybe it was a little overstated. We did that, of course, with genetics, right? The Human Genome Project was going to map every gene, and then we were going to know the genetic cause of everything you mentioned, desires, will, everything, diseases. And we don't, right? Because our understanding of genetics is still at a very early stage. And our understanding of, I would say, neurobiology is at an even earlier stage. Like, we have some good, interesting data on a few things, but we then always want to draw these grand conclusions that are beyond the data. But then, to put the question back at you, right? I would say, how would you measure it, right? If you're going to talk about cerebral processes, neurological processes, and the will, how would you operationalize the will in order to study it, right? This is a question that I don't think neuroscience has answered yet. Most of the time, and this is another one of these little flags, I mean, it's astonishing to me, but you can go look it up yourself. In order to try to get at this question, they will have, often students, college students, play economic games, right? Student A is given $100 and student B is given $80, and they have to exchange them some way to determine their altruism or their will or their self-interest, whatever your variable is. Will is almost entirely mapped onto money, economics, etc. Now, I'm not exactly answering your question. I'm dancing around your question. But for me, these are the more important questions, is to try to get behind how these studies are structured and what they actually can tell us or what they're actually getting at. And in my opinion, we have a long way to go before we can start to answer questions about the connection between certain processes and certain behaviors.
I can add some to that issue. A few years ago, they did a brain analysis of a man in France, and they claimed he had no brain and that he was a bureaucrat. So, the idea that a bureaucrat had no brain got a lot of public exposure. But it turned out that he did have a brain, but his skull was filled almost entirely with fluid. So he had a very thin layer of a neural brain that was inside the skull, maybe about equivalent to 10% or less of a normal brain. And yet he was a normal person. And of course, he didn't have two obvious lobes. He didn't have the whole structure we think of the human brain. Wow. He had this very thin layer. And he was functioning as a relatively low-level bureaucrat. He was not president of France. But that implies a kind of fluidity of location of brain activities that's really completely incompatible with the notion of, this part of the brain will do this for you and so forth, even though genetically that would be the normal development. This man had had a history of brain problems from childhood, and so this thing had emerged slowly as he had different mental problems, but he ends up as a functioning adult, married, working in a bureaucracy in France, and he had this thin layer, less than, I think it was even less than 10%, but a very thin layer going inside the skull, and nothing like what we would normally call a brain. You can look him up under the man with no brain on the internet.
I'm going to.
Second, although it's true that when you stimulate the cortex or parts of the brain, you get often, scenes will come back, memory will come back, certain things of that kind. But apparently, you never get an existential crisis from finding an electrode stimulating something. In other words, a lot of the high-level understandings that we have never seem to be elicited by stimulation of the brain. And I think that's an interesting fact, that it's past memories or that we might get stimulated, and perhaps some of the feelings and emotions that went with them, but that these higher, you don't have a calculus crisis on when you get stimulations, and so that the higher, I would suggest that you'll never get a stimulation of the brain that will give you an existential crisis, that will give you a question about are our brains determined, and so forth and so on. And so there is a level of understanding that is a level of consciousness that I think could probably not be identified as having any neurologically stimulated place. And that would again begin to give us the notion that there is a qualitative distinction between aspects of human consciousness and actual physicality or physiology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, to add, one analogy for those of you who are familiar with the history of genetics, so in the 1970s, 1980s, early 1990s, we had the central dogma: one gene, one protein, right? And they called it the central dogma, which I, as a theologian, thought was hilarious. But and there were, certain kinds of claims that, it was the coding sections of the double helix that were important, and then there was all this junk DNA, that was just junk. And even, I was a young theologian, and I thought, well, if it's there, it's probably not junk. It's probably useful. Yeah. And lo and behold, 5 years ago, all of a sudden, that junk DNA we're discovering, oh, it's actually highly functional, and it's really important, and it has some functions that we don't know about yet. And then in the intervening period, we also began to learn about epigenetics, right? We can both have the exact same gene, but because of our histories, your gene is methylated and functions differently than my gene, so that there is, sort of contextual generational effects that weren't understood at the time, in the early 1980s and 1990s. But at that time, there was this assumption, if you have the gene, you have, whatever the outcome is. So I think, for me, especially the history of genetics, it invites us to a lot more humility about what we know right now about neurobiology. So your example is great. We know a lot of things, but we, just like we use 10% of our brains, we probably know 10% of neurobiology, right? So we really need to be more patient before we start drawing really strong conclusions.
Bueno, esta pretensión, ¿no? de decir,
well, this intention to predict
de determinar, la tenemos muy presente
and to determine is very present through our apps, Netflix, Instagram, that through logarithms they try to control and determine through economics what we have to buy, where we have to be, and it is used nowadays. But thank God we're free. We have free will. Any other questions?
I hope this will not be veering too far off into neurobiological technicality, but one of the most frequently raised arguments in favor of neural determinism is the work of Benjamin Libet on the readiness potential. So briefly, this is a measurement of activity in the brain that precedes a decision, and people have used this very frequently to argue, well, that proves, because the brain is anticipating a decision prior to the individual being consciously aware of the decision, that all the decision is an activity of the brain. It is not a free activity, but it's determined by functions of neurons in the brain that anticipate the decision before the decision is made. So I would love to hear any thoughts on the readiness potential and how one might address it.
Why are they always looking at me? I mean, I would, yeah, so, and this is another one of those things that has transferred very quickly into the public sphere, right? Through people like Jonathan Haidt, especially, and other sort of popularizers of neuroscience, that our brain signals the action, and then usually 2 nanoseconds later, we I think a couple, first of all, I would like to see I'd like to see a study, right? I would really like to dive into his methodology and his assumptions and his N and how many fMRIs did he do. Usually it's like 9. So I haven't looked at that one in detail, but I'd be really interested in doing that. But it also, there's this assumption, right, that a measurable electrical signal is conscious awareness, or is the thing, and that's the act. These claims about our brain, if we think about decision making, I don't know if you've ever made a decision, but I've made decisions, right? And usually my decisions go like, hey, what do you think I should do? Right? My decisions take a long time. They involve a lot of other people, and there's conversation about it. We have this hyper-individualistic model of decision-making that then gets located in our brain, and then probably in our genes that are, stimulating something. But I think all of these assumptions, could be challengeable, right? We can measure electrical signal. Okay, we know how to do that. Well, maybe there's some other operation that we haven't looked for and we're not measuring that is important in the action as a complete thing in terms of consciousness, right? You mentioned consciousness as perhaps not measurable. Yeah, these are the kinds of questions I would want to ask.
I have a few comments. I have read recently there have been methodological criticisms of that work. Second, what if, in fact, you have this development of a neural potential, and then the decision seems to come later? That's the basic logic. But what if you had the neural development of more than one neural development at the same time, representing the two possibilities? In other words, do I do this or do that? I'm talking about an experimental setting where you make a decision between two choices. Okay? Well, what if it turns out that the conscious decision is when one of the two is picked? In other words, the potential precedes both of the possibilities for the choice. And so free choice can still exist at the point of picking which of the two potentials, or more than two potentials, have been arrived at.
Right. And also, I think an assumption that if there's a biological component, it's determined, right? I love my children, and I feel biologically, very connected to them. But I wouldn't call that determined, right? Because it's something that's happening in my body. But if it happens in the brain, if there's an electrical signal in the brain, then that's some sort of determinism. It's also a very, especially in virtue theory, and we tend to be very disembodied, right? It can be a very Gnostic kind of approach where the body is either the sort of passive recipient of, or it's either the source of vice, so we have to control it, right? Or it's the object of virtue formation. And we don't have a rich discourse on the sort of constructive relationship between mind and body yet, I don't think. I think we're moving in that direction, but
yeah.
Go ahead.
As a footnote to the virtue issue, as far as I'm concerned, virtue is a performing art. It's like a virtue. Being courageous is a way of behaving. Being just is a way of behaving. And that just like playing the piano, it's a virtue because you can play it, but just thinking about playing the piano is not a virtue, or is not being a pianist. And so I would argue that a virtue is always a performing art. And that's why you need homework for your clients. And for yourself, of course, as we've been talking about.
First of all. Bueno, pues yo creo que hemos aportado
I think
bastante luz sobre este asunto.
our speakers have shed a lot of light on this topic. It's incredible, your contribution. And we are living with a clear message. We have to be very responsible and cultivate ourselves to flourish and be able to go together with our students and be free and enjoy life. So thank you very much. It has been a true pleasure.